All right, everyone, we're working on the 928 today, a 1981 competition package. It's on the Quick Jacks, been up here for a couple months. I'm going to go over some issues I've had trying to replace the brake rotors and figure out what upgrades were done and how to do upgrades on a 928. Also, I'm going to cover a couple tricks I learned doing ball joint replacement, upper and lower. So let me start at the beginning and highlight my mistakes, if you will. So I had this car for 6 or 8 months, and I was driving it to work one day, and the rear tire blew out, and tires, it looked like they were in good shape. They were, I don't know, some Italian design I never heard of. I never did find a date code on them, but tire blew out, no big deal. I got the car towed back here, got it up on the stand, went and got 2 new tires, rear tires, and then a few weeks later I went and got 2 front tires. So I'd already tightened the backs down, and when I had the car up on the jacks and did the front, I couldn't tighten the lugs down because it was up on the stand, and I left it up here because I wanted to adjust the Koni coilovers. When I bought the car, the previous owner said they didn't rub. Well, I guess I'm fatter than him or something because they rubbed with me, so I'd adjust them a couple other times and needed really one more adjustment, at least I was hoping for, to get those adjusted. So I just left this up, but I didn't do the adjustment for a week or two. You might see where I'm going with this. So a couple weeks later I adjusted the coilovers, and 10 o'clock at night, I'm great, let's go out for a test drive, see if this works. Driving down the road, felt pretty good, and then I start hearing the front tires rub. And I thought that shouldn't be happening. It's the rear tire, never front, never rubbed. The rear is the one I adjusted. And then you guessed it, bam! And took me a second to figure out what happened. And the key, or the clue I should say, was the front left tire rolling down the road away from me. So I was able to get the car off to the side of the road, actually sort of at an intersection on a relatively safe spot of road. Yeah, so the tire came off. Obviously, I'd never torqued the lugs down, so pretty costly mistake. You can see I got some fender damage. I'll go into all the stuff I had to replace to get this thing back going, and I'm still working on it. So I looked for the wheel, and the worst part of it, I never actually found the wheel. I went into the brush. There was some terrain. It may be in the Potomac River for all I know. It went downhill, and I'm hoping maybe I could find it in the winter when the brush isn't so green, but I've looked a lot trying to find this thing. I never found it, so I had to get the car towed without the wheel, which was harder. I actually first came home and pulled the wheel off my 86 944, hoping it would work, and it probably would have, except these have been upgraded brakes, which don't fit under a 15-inch phone dial wheel from a 944. So I got the car towed back to my house, where it sat in the front of my house for a while, so I didn't have a wheel for it. The spare is long since shot. So I had to buy a new wheel, $285. I had to get it painted, since the other ones were painted black. $100 for that. Well, actually would have been more, but they did a terrible job, so they gave me a discount. And then I had to buy a tire for $160. The other thing that it did was pretty much wore through the bottom half of the drop link, and luckily everything else wasn't too bad. There are a little bit of scratches up there. It did crack the front spoiler, and then the fender is broken, cracked, and dented. I was able to source a used fender off an 81, although it is red, so I have to get that painted still. And then the brake rotor was pretty badly damaged, as you could guess. There's the right one, and there's the left one. Actually, could have been a lot worse. So to drag this out too much, but so basically I had to replace N-Link Drop Link. I got that for $70 from 928 International. And then the previous owner had told me that he had upgraded the brakes to S4 brakes, which he had, but when I ordered S4 rotors, they weren't the same size. They were significantly smaller than those other rotors. They were 11 something inches, I think 304 millimeters. And what I have are 13 millimeters, and they're two-piece. And they're actually pretty light for how big they are because they're two-piece rotors. 13 inch, 330 millimeters. So, and so then I thought, what the heck? Well, maybe he put GTS rotors on there with the S4 brakes, or maybe I had just GTS brakes after all. GTS brake pads didn't work, and neither did the rotors. They were still too small. Those were 12 something inches. So then I finally talked to Jeannie at 928 Specialist in Florida, and she told me that the upgraded S4 brakes for all the 928s were based on 993 rotors. Now my car, and those require a brake caliper adapter that looks like this, which basically changes the offset to make it work. And these were designed off of early car spindles. So mine's an 81, so I thought I had an early spindle on my car. So I had to order, so I got the rotors from her. They looked like they would fit, except they were rubbing on the ball joint carrier, and they were still smaller, but they didn't work on the brake caliper adapters I had on my car, because the guy who had my car made his own caliper adapters out of steel, and they fit something like that. And then he ran a spacer on there to use the 330 millimeter rotors. So that stuff wasn't lining up correctly. So I thought about finding some 330 millimeter rotors and replacing them. I did find some from EBC, but they were $900, and I didn't really want to spend that and or send another set of rotors back. So my other option at that point was to try and get a caliper adapter that fit. As you can see, the difference between what everybody else had and what my one-offs were made for. So a lot of people make these adapters, but nobody actually has them in stock, so you have to special order them. End up taking 5 or 6 weeks. So I had an 81, and I assumed it had early car spindles. So when I got the caliper adapters, and then I tried to go put them on, and they don't fit. So did some more research. Turns out they switched the spindles in the middle of the 81 VIN, and also, since mine is a competition package, it has the S spindle. So all the cars from late 81 up until pre-S4 spindles, you either have to replace them with early car spindles or entire S4 front suspension to use S4 brakes. If you have an S4 suspension, you don't need the caliper adapters because they redid everything at that point. But early on, they made these brake caliper adapters to fit the S4 rotors, or sorry, S4 brakes calipers with a 993 rotor. So luckily I was able to find a early car spindle on eBay for about 120 bucks, and then as you can see the difference, it's really the difference in the diameter of the mounting holes. So these are about 3 inches center to center, and these are closer to 4. So these actually fit on here. So those go on there, your calipers bolt onto that, and that corrects your offset. So while I was in here, I also discovered that A, my ball joints were bad, and B, this was the original aluminum ball joint carrier that had been upgraded to steel later on, and I guess in certain cases these have been known to fail. So while I made a bad mistake and jacked up my car, I may have avoided a future problem by discovering this old part that needed to be upgraded. So I was able to get the upgraded steel ball joint carrier that also slightly different design with the eccentric bolts on how you adjust the camber and toe. If I can find the other new one. So you can see the difference in the holes. And the nice thing about this is it comes, ball joints are already installed, so you don't have to worry about the lower ones. And then my upper ball joint was also worn, at least two of them were, one of them was. So 3 out of the 4 boots were torn on the ball joints, but I'm pretty sure they're all shot. So I ended up ordering new ones for the upper as well. So I'm in the process of replacing the upper, and I'd watched a couple videos online. Roaring Tiger Garage does a good video on how to get this apart and take it, put it back together. The only thing different that I wanted to add to their video was that I didn't remove the wishbone, and they did. So when you put it back in, it's a the kit. It's pretty nice kit from Renbei. It's got a copper coupling. Drop that in, then the ball joint, then the cap, and then the spring, and then it's got some washers that you can use as spacers if you need to before the top cap. And their kit also has Zeus fasteners that go on top, so you can replace your oil, or sorry, your grease if you need to. So when you press all this back together, before you put the Zeus fitting on, you got to press this in and then put your circlip down into the ring down in there, and you've got to compress that spring. So they took the whole wishbone off and stuck it in a vise. Now getting it apart, I didn't do that. I just used a C-clamp and I used a big socket on the bottom, and then the top you can just press it straight on there. When I put it back on there, I'm going to use a piece of PVC pipe, because the ball joint will be back in there, putting it back together when you have to compress it. The other trick to taking these things apart is trying to separate your tie rod and your ball joints from the steering knuckle yoke. And one way to do it is use a pickle fork. It's just a big fork, and you jam it in there and it pops it off, but it usually tears the boot. So my ball joint boots were torn, so I wasn't worried about that, but my tie rods looked okay. So the other trick I learned online was to get a big sledgehammer or hammer. This is a 4-pound hammer, and you can bang on the end of these and eventually pop them out. 4 pounds seem to work pretty well. It's heavy enough to give it some mass and small enough so you don't beat up all your aluminum bits. But you can hit these things pretty hard. I mean, there's no marks on that at all. I beat on those, so that'll focus, and almost nothing. So eventually that comes off. So now I'm getting ready to put it back together, and I wasn't going to do the wheel bearings at first, but then they looked, I'm assuming that play in there is bad, so I'm hoping to, the last part I'm waiting on is my wheel bearings to come in today and knock out the races get them back in. Roaring Tiger also does a good video on how to do your wheel bearings, as does Arena 3568 or something. I can't remember his number, but the German guy, he's got some great videos if you don't mind reading subtitles. So at the end of the day, I'm going to have pretty much brand new everything: ball joints, ball joint carrier, wheel bearings, new rotors, new pads. Actually replaced some of the seals on the caliper as well, and cleaned up spindle. So I have an 81 with a even earlier spindle with S4 brakes, so it's real hodgepodge, but it should be a pretty good braking system. So the rotors that I had were 330 millimeter, but they're really sort of overkill for those pads. You can see how much of the rotor wasn't even being used, while these basically are, I think they're actually, they're still lighter than these. They're still a little bit, they're bigger and yet they're still lighter. But that extra part on the rotor isn't really going to do any good. And this is the other side, pretty much the same, except I never took the caliper off. Oh, one other thing. While I had this all torn apart, I was going to upgrade the brake lines to stainless steel, and I bought some nice lines for that as well. But trying to get these apart, a real bitch. There's a 11 millimeter nut right there, and I started it with a regular box nut and started to strip it, and then I switched to a flare nut, sorry, a flare wrench, one of these suckers, and it still didn't come off. Even I soaked it in PB Blaster, it basically stripped that out. I might be able to cut that hose, that line, and put a new adapter there, but the biggest problem of doing that was the actual flare kit to make a new flare, and to do that, which I don't have the tool for, so I'm gonna have to save the brake line work for another day. So I'm just gonna leave these old lines on here for now, and then hopefully I only have to bleed this one, but the rest of them connect up in here. As you can't see, it's too dark, but I couldn't get the other end of the line off either, so probably gonna have to, you know, it's gonna take a lot more effort to get it out. So I wanted to get this thing put back together and back on the road, because it's been up here for way too long. So I got this all put back together. Both wheel bearings in there. The upper ball joint replaced, although I don't think I mixed the epoxy very well, because this side and both the other side didn't set real well, and I'll show you on the other side. I'm getting some grease popping out, but everything turned out really well. These are the 993 rotors with the S4 calipers, and you can't really see the adapter, but I don't have the rotor on the other side, so I'll show you that side. So on this side, here's just the wheel hub, caliper adapter, and another bolt. And a couple things I wanted to mention. The guys at Roaring Tiger Garage that I mentioned that did the A-arm ball joint replacement, they did that on a 944 turbo. So it was a lower control arm and not the upper. And slightly different. I mean, it's basically the same process, but as you can see, there's some grease popping out of there. So this lower where is it? The lower nut on the upper ball joint, the ball joint will turn as you try to tighten it. So you need to, according to the workshop manual, you put a pry bar on the A-arm and wedge it down. And I just took my C-clamp wouldn't fit, but I picked up this other clamp at Lowe's. The biggest C-clamp they had was 8 inches, which wouldn't fit. You need about a 10-inch clamp, and then just tighten it down, and then you can tighten this go. Tighten that nut. As you can see, I got some grease kind of squirting out there, so I think I'm gonna have to redo that epoxy to fish that stuff out. And then I think what I'll do, I just squeezed it in there and tried to mix it up afterwards. I'll squeeze it into a small Tupperware, mix it up really well, and then take another syringe and suck it out and then squeeze it in there so it's nice and mixed. That didn't set up real well. But otherwise, it came out right. See, that's about the right tightness on the wheel bearing that you want on that. So here's the caliper, brake caliper adapter. So now I just got to put the rest of it together. So to wrap up, tighten your lug nuts. I'm not gonna lie, I felt pretty stupid doing that one. Came home and the wife actually laughed and said, well, all the work you've done on the car, it's amazing something didn't happen sooner. So she was great. You know, it's one of those things, if you haven't fucked something up, I guarantee you probably will. So you're not alone out there. You make mistakes and don't feel bad for yourself for about 5 minutes, and then, you know, stop feeling sorry for yourself and then go fix it. That's really all I got to do. I have to do at this point, or all I can do. A little bit of a costly mistake. I had some extra money that I was hoping to use for something else, but putting the car back together and making a lot of repairs that I didn't really need. I didn't know that I needed, but it's probably good that I'm doing them. So I think that is a takeaway, lesson learned for me. Like I said, doing this, if you're a young kid, 18, you know, in your teens still, 20 still, and you haven't learned that life's a bitch and it's going to throw you a curveball, you're going to figure it out eventually. But, you know, shit happens. It happens to everybody. Everybody makes mistakes. Try to learn from them, learn from other people's mistakes, and then, you know, pick yourself up and go fix them and move on. So that's my spiel for today. Save the manual.